Hey Patreon viewers, this is a video just for you guys. So I've just finished shooting a video which probably by the time you see this, you will have seen the video that I've made for the public channel that is related to this, and it's talking about the weight of medieval arming swords and the fact that this River Dordogne sword that Hermann Historicus sold a few years ago is recorded as being 1660 grams, which actually, when we start looking at all the stats of medieval arming swords, is not hugely bizarre, it's not hugely unusual. There are a significant number of medieval one-handed swords, whether it be Viking era swords or all the way through to 15th, 16th century swords, which are quite heavy, which are this kind of weight, like 3.5 pounds, 1500, 1600 grams. It's not really bizarre, it's not really unusual. And now what I want to say is that, so this is 1200 grams, and this is a fairly beefy sword, especially, you know, given that it's not very long. You don't have a lot of reach with this. Now, I want to say that for people who do fencing and for people who do HEMA and perhaps even reenactment to a degree as well, small weight differences like this can really make a significant difference. And I've encountered this recently myself because I've been testing out various new up-and-coming prototypes or models of sabres, of fencing sabres. Now, those sabres vary in range a lot, okay? And I've got one sabre that I'm currently using which weighs around 1200, 1300 grams. Now, bear in mind, the usual sabre I use is about 850 to 900 grams. The historical gymnasium sabres that it's based on only weigh 800 grams. A lot of the people doing Italian dueling sabre are using sabres that weigh 600 or 700 grams, okay? So we've got light sabres at 600 or 700 grams. The sabres that I mostly use around 800-900 grams, perhaps up to 1000 grams. And then we've now got some heavier models of sabre coming in that are like 1200-1300 grams. My rapier is a big sword and that's 1300 grams. Okay, so when we're talking about a medieval arming sword that is shorter than those swords, at least in blade reach, it's got a shorter blade, and it doesn't have any real hand protection apart from a crossguard, that weighs 1660 grams. I mean, going on for 1700 grams. That, when you put that into context, that is a heavy sword, okay? Now, that's not to say you can't move it around and hit effectively with it, and I have seen some people saying, oh yeah, Matt, I test cut with a sword that weighs about that weight and it's no problem at all. Yeah, absolutely. I've got some big swords that weigh that much and more that I can test cut with. But when you're trying to fight someone, when you're trying to fence someone, assuming we're talking about unarmored with no shields or that kind of stuff, it's really difficult. And that extra 1 or 2 or 3 or 400 or even more 100 grams, 500, 600 extra grams in your hand and in the inertia of the weapon that you're moving around is a massive disadvantage. Literally, if I've got a sabre, and if me and my opponent are roughly equal skill, so if we say that me and Pedro, for example, are fencing sabre, and he's using one of our normal sabres that weighs about 850 to 900 grams, and I'm using a sabre which weighs 1200 grams, yes, the point of balance has some part to play in that, in terms of how quick the tip will move and things like that. But generally speaking, a 900 gram sabre versus a 1200 gram sabre, thinking about the percentage difference, that's taking a whole third of the 900 gram sabre and adding it on. Okay, that's a hell of a lot more weight in your hand to move around. And one of my fellow club members last night borrowed the 1200 gram sabre and was quite surprised by what a beast it is to move around. Now, part of this is how you use the sword. If you've got a heavier weapon, you can't use it in the same way as the person who's fighting against you using the lighter weapon. You have to use it in different ways. So holding the arm outstretched, for example, becomes incredibly tiring with a heavier kind of sword. But what I'd conclude by saying is that when you're looking at the 1600 gram medieval arming sword and then comparing it to a 900 gram military sabre, remember they were used in really, really different ways and in really different contexts. The 900 gram sabre would be held in extended guards, usually high second or terce or something like this, or maybe medium guard, but in extended guards with the hand forward and with moulinets, with cuts from the wrist and this type of motion. Very quick, very efficient. and you wouldn't be wearing really any, apart from your clothes and maybe a hat or a helmet, you wouldn't be wearing any protection. So any cut or thrust could put you out of action in theory. Whereas the medieval arming sword is used in a context where lots of people are wearing arming jackets and gambesons and helmets, and when you go to hit someone, you're not holding the weapon out extended, you're probably starting with the weapon back, and you're stepping through with the blow and you're stepping with the blow. You're swinging the sword, you're moving the sword in a different way, you're stepping in a different way. The things that you're hitting, what the other people are wearing, is very different. So it's really, comparing like with like is not fair, because the Victorian or Napoleonic sabre or spadroon or whatever or even a basket hilt is used in an utterly different context and used in an utterly different way to the medieval arming sword. And remember also, the medieval arming sword is often not used by itself. In fairness, they were often used by themselves as well, as a last ditch, essentially as a giant knife, or dagger, but they were often used with a buckler or with a shield, or, you know, this kind of stuff, or wearing degrees of armour. So it's a completely different context, and in that context, yes indeed, it may pay to have a slightly bigger, heavy, or not necessarily bigger in terms of longer, but beefier and heavier and stiffer sword that's able to puncture through mail or puncture through gambesons and bash against bits of armour and block people swinging halberds at your head and this kind of stuff. So absolutely different kind of, very different type of sword, despite the fact they're both one-hand swords, completely different sword for a completely different fighting context and used in a very different way. Cheers for watching, and see you for the next video. Cheers folks!